Good evening, and welcome back. Settle in, breathe softly, and let the room grow quiet. Tonight is for slow footsteps through distant halls, for gentle voices carried across centuries. Civilizations rise and fade like tides. Myths drift beside courts and candlelight. Old puzzles linger in the spaces between power and longing, like notes left under a door. This is a calm journey through the shadows that follow thrones. Not battles, not noise, only the soft current of choices made in private rooms, where whispers shape the daylight. The names are not needed yet. The story will arrive in smooth, unhurried waves, one after another, until time itself feels drowsy. If you are listening to sleep, welcome. If you are here to wander through history, welcome. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let the question rest on the air, and let your thoughts slow to meet it. Blankets up, lights low. Breathe in, breathe out. Now let's begin. The night opens slowly, with the hush of calm voices and the stillness of stories not yet told. This is a place for steady footsteps through time, where tales are not rushed, where details unfold with patience, and where the listener may drift as history flows like a quiet stream. Tonight, the subject is delicate and old, woven with both fascination and unease. It is the long thread of women who were once called dangerous, not by blades or armies, but by their place at the side of rulers, kings, and emperors. They were remembered as mistresses, companions of power, sometimes feared, sometimes adored, and often spoken of as shadows behind thrones. The history of mistresses is the history of power told through intimacy. In royal courts, in palaces, and in hidden chambers, their presence was constant. They were women who did not always wear crowns, but whose influence stretched into the decisions of monarchs, into wars and treaties, into the rise and fall of dynasties. Their stories are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are simply the slow shaping of opinion whispered at night, or the patient arrangement of patronage for artists, courtiers, and families. Yet in every generation, the idea of the mistress seemed both alluring and threatening. For kings, she was comfort and delight. For queens, she was danger and rivalry. For people of the realm, she was mystery, and sometimes she was blamed for misfortunes that touched the crown. To begin, one must return to ancient times. In the courts of pharaohs, in the palaces of Babylon, in the long marble halls of Rome, rulers often surrounded themselves with many women. Some were wives bound by law and ritual. Others were concubines, selected for beauty, lineage, or alliance. And among them were figures who rose above the rest, women remembered not as fleeting companions, but as mistresses who shaped the lives of kings. Their names drift through history in fragments. Some are known clearly, like Cleopatra, though she was queen, yet often cast in the role of mistress to Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Others are shadows in records, names inscribed only briefly, remembered only in whispers. In medieval courts, the pattern continued. Kings of France, of England, of Spain, often kept official mistresses, a practice that over time became almost ceremonial. The title Maîtresse en titre in France carried dignity, wealth, and visible presence at court. These women walked openly in spaces where influence was thick, and their power was both recognized and resented. They were not always villains, though history often paints them as such. Many acted as patrons of the arts, protectors of the poor, and benefactors of learning. Yet because their lives touched forbidden power, they were written as dangerous. Danger, in this sense, was rarely a matter of weapons or rebellion. It was the quiet danger of persuasion, A king might turn his face toward one woman, and by doing so, turn the fortunes of families, nobles, and nations. A mistress could encourage peace, or she could encourage war. She might calm the temper of a ruler, or she might sharpen it. For those who lived at court, watching such influence was both unsettling and unavoidable. The story of dangerous mistresses is not one story, but many. It is the tale of women across centuries, from royal favorites in Renaissance palaces to courtesans in gilded salons. It is a story that moves through time, from France to England, from Russia to China, from emperors to revolutionaries. Each era has its figures, remembered with suspicion or admiration, sometimes both at once. As the story begins, let the pace remain steady. Each figure will appear in turn, each moment unfolding with quiet detail. This first step is only to set the stage, to let the listener settle into the idea that behind the noise of politics and the clash of armies, there was also the soft and steady presence of voices that spoke in chambers, in gardens, in private halls where decisions were not announced, but slowly formed. The origins of this tradition are not always clear. Some would say it is as old as monarchy itself. Wherever rulers stood above others, there were those who became close to them, not through formal crowns, but through personal ties. These ties became powerful, and once powerful, they became feared. Over time, chronicles and storytellers gave these women a name, mistresses, not wives, not queens, but companions marked by intimacy, and in that intimacy, by danger. And so, as the night deepens, the story moves gently forward. Soon will come the portraits of individuals, each one a thread in this long fabric. Their lives were filled with whispers, with gifts, with jealousy, and with the weight of history pressing quietly upon them. One by one, their names will unfold, beginning in the courts of medieval Europe, where the idea of the royal mistress took on new shape, and where the first women to hold such places began to leave a record that survives to this day. The listener may rest in this thought that history is not always carried by soldiers or kings, but also by those who lived in the quiet spaces between duty and desire. From here, the journey will move slowly to the stories of France, where mistresses became as known as monarchs themselves, where their beauty, wit, and power shaped an entire age, and where the label of danger followed them at every step. The courts of France provide the clearest window into how mistresses became not only personal companions of kings, but public figures who shaped culture, politics, and history. From the 13th century onward, chronicles begin to describe them with greater detail. By the Renaissance, the French royal mistress was an institution in itself, accepted, feared, and recorded with patience by observers of the age. To understand the most dangerous mistresses in history, France is the natural place to begin, for it was there that the role reached its height of formality and influence. King Francis I of France, who reigned in the early 16th century, marked the turning point. He was a patron of the arts, a man who brought the Renaissance spirit into France, and alongside his official duties stood women who held sway over him in ways his ministers could not. His reign established a pattern that would repeat again and again. The king might have a queen by law, but he also had a mistress by choice, and that mistress could rise to near-official status. The most famous example came a century later with King Henry IV and his mistress Gabrielle d'Estrées. Gabrielle was not only a companion, but also a counselor. Her influence extended into political matters. She spoke for factions at court. She mediated between nobles. She was openly seen as the king's intended partner, and though she never became queen, Her presence threatened established lines of power. When she died suddenly in 1599, rumors spread quickly that she had been poisoned. Many believed that her death was the result of fear, that her growing influence had become intolerable to others. This suspicion lingered for generations, and Gabrielle's name remained bound to the idea of the mistress who was too powerful to be safe. The 17th century saw the role of mistress become almost ceremonial. Under Louis XIV, the Sun King, the royal mistress was not hidden but displayed. Louise de la Vallière was among the earliest, gentle and modest, yet loved deeply by the king. Later came Madame de Montespan, whose wit and sharp presence dominated the French court for years. Madame de Montespan was feared by rivals and envied by courtiers. Her apartments became the true center of power, where favors were granted, alliances were formed, and reputations were made. Her position was so secure that even when scandals of witchcraft and dark rituals touched her name, she retained her place longer than many thought possible. Her eventual replacement was Madame de Maintenon, who began her life at court as governess to the king's illegitimate children. With patience and discretion, she gained Louis's affection, and though never officially crowned queen, she became his companion in his later years, offering advice and guiding his piety. In her, the role of mistress transformed once more. She was not dazzling or scandalous, but steady, serious, and deeply influential. She demonstrates how the figure of the mistress could shift from enchantress to advisor, from danger of passion to danger of quiet control. It was in these same halls that another dangerous mistress would rise, perhaps the most famous of all, Madame de Pompadour. Born Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, she was not of noble birth, yet she ascended to become the official mistress of Louis XV. Her charm, intelligence, and grace captivated the king, but her true strength lay in her ability to navigate the politics of Versailles. She became a patron of philosophers, artists, and architects. She encouraged the works of Voltaire. She guided the style of Rococo that came to define the century. Her enemies whispered constantly against her, but she endured. For 20 years, she shaped not only the king's private life, but also the culture of France itself. She showed that the mistress could become a cultural power, setting taste and guiding thought, leaving behind a legacy not of scandal, but of art and ideas. The pattern is clear. In France, the mistress was dangerous not because of rebellion or bloodshed, but because her influence was subtle, pervasive, and deeply personal. She could change the course of policy with a word. She could redirect the flow of patronage with a gesture, and she could alter the king's mood in ways no minister could. The court lived in constant awareness of this. Ministers plotted to gain her favor. Nobles begged for her attention. Queens suffered under her shadow. And the people, watching from a distance, often blamed her when fortunes turned against them. These stories, calm and enduring, show how power can flow through channels that are not official, yet remain decisive. The French mistresses remind us that history is shaped not only in parliaments and battlefields, but also in private chambers where a king listened to a voice he trusted, and that voice belonged to a woman remembered as dangerous. From here, the story may travel further across Europe. England, too, had its mistresses, though the tradition was less formal. There, they were remembered with scandal and controversy, shaping politics during the reigns of the Stuarts and later with the Hanoverian kings. These women stood at the edge of power, influencing parliaments and policies, yet always watched with suspicion. Their presence carried the same tension. the blend of fascination, envy, and fear that followed all royal favorites. The path leads next to England, to the reign of Charles II, where the court sparkled with wit and excess, and where mistresses such as Nell Gwynn and Barbara Villiers became names that outlived the generations, celebrated and condemned in equal measure. Their stories reveal another side of danger, one touched with comedy, extravagance, and the restless energy of a nation caught between monarchy and parliament, faith and doubt, loyalty and suspicion. When the story moves across the Channel to England, the role of the mistress takes on a different shape. Here, the tradition was less formal, less recognized by title, and yet equally powerful. In France, mistresses were given rooms at Versailles, titles at court, and sometimes honors that placed them above nobles. In England, the mistresses of kings lived in an atmosphere of controversy and constant watchfulness. They were part of a political stage that balanced monarchy, parliament, and public opinion. Their influence was undeniable, but it was always shadowed by scandal. The reign of Charles II in the 17th century brought the English royal mistress into full view. After years of exile during the Cromwellian Commonwealth, Charles returned to the throne in 1660, bringing with him a court filled with energy, extravagance, and wit. He was called the Merry Monarch, and his court reflected that title. Theaters reopened, banquets filled the evenings, and politics mingled with entertainments. At the center of it all were his mistresses, who came to symbolize the excesses and the vibrancy of the Restoration. Among the most famous was Barbara Villiers, later the Duchess of Cleveland. Known for her beauty, ambition, and strong personality, she quickly became one of Charles's most influential companions. She was bold, outspoken, and unafraid to push her own interests. At court, she secured wealth and titles for herself and her children. Nobles feared her temper, and politicians recognized her ability to sway the king's decisions. Barbara embodied the image of the dangerous mistress, someone whose presence unsettled courtiers, angered parliamentarians, and placed the monarchy under public scrutiny. Another figure from Charles's court was Nell Gwynn, a woman of humbler origins who rose from the world of the theater to become beloved of the king. Nell was witty, charming, and adored by the common people. Unlike Barbara, she was not feared but admired. Her influence lay not in political maneuvering, but in her ability to soften the king's image. While nobles and politicians resented the wealth given to other mistresses, they often forgave Nell for her simplicity and humor. She shows how the role of mistress could vary, sometimes dangerous, sometimes endearing, but always watched. Charles II had many mistresses, each leaving their mark on the life of the court. Together, they represented the openness of the Restoration period, where royal favorites were not hidden but known to all. This openness created tension. Parliament watched with disapproval. Religious leaders preached against immorality, and yet the king continued to surround himself with women whose presence shaped both his reign and his reputation. The influence of these women extended beyond personal companionship. They became figures of patronage. Artists, playwrights, and poets dedicated works to them. Political factions sought their favor, hoping that through them they could reach the ear of the king. Their children, often acknowledged by Charles, became entwined with noble families, weaving the bloodline of mistresses into the fabric of English aristocracy. After Charles, the tradition of mistresses continued, though it never held the same brilliance as under the Merry Monarch. Later kings, such as George I and George II, kept mistresses, but the atmosphere of their courts was different. These mistresses held influence in quieter ways, guiding policies, protecting allies, and shaping the lives of those who sought advancement. They were not celebrated as figures of wit and beauty in the same way, but they carried the same mark of danger, that personal relationships could direct the course of public power. In England, the mistress became a point of tension between monarchy and public opinion. Where France embraced the official mistress, England judged her harshly. Pamphlets, plays, and gossip circulated widely, attacking not only the women but also the kings who kept them. This scrutiny reveals another form of danger, the way that mistresses could weaken the image of monarchy itself. They were seen as symbols of excess, reminders of favoritism, and sometimes scapegoats for the failures of kings. Still, they left their mark on culture. The Restoration Court became a place of theater, wit, and fashion. The mistresses of Charles II were part of this cultural flowering, and their presence helped shape the atmosphere of the time. Through them, the line between entertainment and politics blurred, and the story of the English monarchy was tied not only to parliaments and wars, but also to the women who shared the king's company. As the story drifts forward, the path widens once more. Beyond France and England, the presence of powerful mistresses is found in many courts across Europe and beyond. In Russia, in the 18th century, noble women rose through the ranks of companionship into positions of immense power, sometimes leading directly to the throne itself. In China, in the Forbidden City, imperial concubines shaped dynasties through influence, rivalry, and survival. Across cultures, the pattern repeats. Intimacy with rulers became a channel of influence, and with influence came danger. The next step leads east into the palaces of Russia, where the shadow of mistresses often turned into the substance of rulers, and where the line between consort and empress was crossed more than once. There, the story of danger takes on a sharper edge, for in Russia, the mistress could become not only a companion, but a sovereign in her own right. In the wide expanse of Russia, where winters pressed heavily upon the land and palaces stood like fortresses, the role of mistress often carried, with it, the seeds of far greater ambition. In France and England, mistresses were companions and counselors, shaping culture and policy. In Russia, they sometimes became rulers themselves. The line between intimacy and sovereignty was not always firm, and many who began as favorites of czars rose higher than court custom ever intended. During the reign of Peter the Great, the Russian court began to transform from medieval tradition into something more aligned with Western Europe. Peter himself was a ruler of immense energy, known for reform, conquest, and an often turbulent personal life. His mistresses were numerous, yet one stood apart. Marta Samuilovna Skavronskaya, a woman of humble origins who began as a laundress and servant. Through Peter's affection, she became known as Catherine, and in time, she rose not only to be his consort, but his successor. Catherine I of Russia began her life far from power. Born to a Lithuanian peasant family, she entered Peter's household under uncertain circumstances, first as a servant, later as a companion. Her loyalty, simplicity, and calm presence gained his trust. In 1712, he married her, though she had long been known as his mistress before that union. When Peter died in 1725, she was crowned Empress of Russia. Here, the story of the mistress reached its extreme form, from dangerous companion to sovereign ruler. Her reign was brief, but it set a precedent. Mistresses could become empresses, and in Russia, this would happen more than once. The most famous example was Catherine II, remembered as Catherine the Great. Though she entered Russia as a bride to the heir, her path to power was shaped by her position at court, and her mastery of alliances. She was not merely a mistress in the sense of companionship to rulers. She herself kept favorites, many of whom rose through her affection to positions of great influence. Under her, the role of mistress shifted entirely. She was both sovereign and chooser, both ruler and patroness of companions who owed their fortunes to her. Catherine's reign shows how the pattern of intimacy and power could reverse itself. Not the woman rising by the king, but men rising by the empress. Between these two Catherines lay other examples. The court of the Romanovs was filled with women who began as companions and became political players. Anna Ivanovna, niece of Peter the Great, rose to the throne in 1730. Though her power did not begin as a mistress, her reign demonstrated again how women could dominate Russian politics in ways that unsettled nobles and reshaped the empire. Behind them were countless figures of quieter presence, favorites whose names do not echo so loudly in history, but who were remembered in court records, letters, and diaries as women whose intimacy with rulers guided choices of war, peace, and succession. The danger in Russia was sharper because the stakes were greater. In a land of vast distance and shifting loyalty, the influence of a mistress was not only personal, but often decisive for survival. A word in the ear of a czar could lead to the exile of a noble family. A gesture of favor could raise a soldier to command. A rumor whispered against a rival could end in Siberia, or worse. In this atmosphere, mistresses were never merely companions. They were players in a dangerous game where love and politics could not be separated. The cultural impact was also deep. Russian mistresses were not always patrons of the arts in the same way as French favorites, but they became symbols of both fear and fascination. Their rise from obscurity to power reflected the unpredictable nature of Russian life, where peasants could sometimes rise to palaces, and where the favor of the sovereign could overturn centuries of rank. This gave their stories a legendary quality. To the people, they seemed figures of destiny, women who carried fortune or ruin in their hands. As the 18th century closed, the tradition of powerful favorites in Russia continued. Catherine the Great's companions, such as Grigory Potemkin, remind us again that intimacy and politics in Russia often intertwined in both directions. Mistresses, favorites, consorts, all were part of a court life that never fully separated private bonds from public power. The thread that began in France with glittering salons and in England with scandalous courts, in Russia became a path to the throne itself. Here, the mistress was not only dangerous, she could become supreme. From Russia, the story extends further into other empires where the pattern repeated with variations. In China, within the walls of the Forbidden City, emperors were surrounded by consorts and concubines. Among them, certain women rose to prominence, shaping dynasties from behind silk screens and carved gates. Theirs was a world of rivalry, survival, and influence carried not in public courts, but in hidden chambers. To understand the most dangerous mistresses in history, one must next enter that world of dragons and phoenixes, where imperial power was shared in whispers and glances. In China, the world of the imperial court was both vast and confined. Within the great walls of the Forbidden City, emperors ruled over millions, yet their daily lives unfolded in quiet halls and secluded gardens. Here, the system of wives, concubines, and consorts was carefully ordered, yet within this order lay deep currents of rivalry and influence. Among these women, a few rose to such prominence that they were remembered as dangerous mistresses of history, figures whose closeness to the emperor shaped the destiny of dynasties. Unlike in France or England, the role of the imperial mistress was not public, but enclosed. It existed within the palace, hidden from ordinary eyes, structured by rank and ritual. The emperor's principal wife, the empress, held the highest position, but she was often surrounded by dozens, even hundreds, of consorts and concubines. Each woman's rank determined her living quarters, her attendance, and her chances of seeing the emperor. Yet within this hierarchy, the emperor's personal affection could lift one woman above all others. That affection carried immense power. During the Han Dynasty, stories already circulated of women whose influence over emperors caused both fascination and alarm. Empress Lu Ji, though officially wife and later Empress Dowager, began as a consort who learned how to navigate the dangers of court life. Her rise demonstrated that intimacy with the ruler could be a pathway to supreme authority. Later dynasties saw similar figures, remembered not only for beauty, but for political maneuvering, often accused of turning emperors away from their duties and weakening the state. Perhaps the most famous of all was Wu Zetian. She entered the palace of Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty as a low-ranking concubine. After his death, she became a consort of his successor, Emperor Gaozong. Through patience, intelligence, and relentless ambition, she gained power step by step. First, she became the favored consort, then the empress, and finally, the ruler in her own name. Wu Zetian remains the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. Her story shows the ultimate reach of influence, from mistress of the emperor to sovereign over the empire. To some, she was remembered as cruel, manipulative, and dangerous. To others, she was a capable ruler who strengthened the Tang dynasty. In both views, her path began with intimacy and ended with absolute power. Centuries later, in the Ming and Qing dynasties, the presence of imperial mistresses continued to shape events. Records speak of favored concubines who diverted the emperor's attention, shifting resources, granting titles, and altering policies. In some reigns, factions at court formed around these women, leading to rivalries that stretched into government. Officials often complained that emperors spent too much time in the company of their favorites, neglecting state affairs. Whether these complaints were fair or exaggerated, they reflect how deeply the figure of the imperial mistress unsettled those who served the throne. The last great example was Empress Dowager Cixi of the Qing dynasty. She entered the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine to the Jianfeng emperor. By winning his favor, she gave birth to his only surviving son. From that moment, her position changed. When the emperor died, she became Empress Dowager, ruling behind the throne as regent for her young son and later for her nephew. For nearly half a century, she controlled the empire, guiding policies, facing rebellions, and navigating the pressures of foreign powers. Cixi was never officially sovereign, but her grip on power was unmistakable. Like Wu Zetian before her, her story began in the inner chambers of the palace and ended with the direction of an empire. The danger of these figures lay not in open rebellion, but in the subtle combination of affection and authority. Within the Forbidden City, where silence and ritual shaped daily life, the emperor's choice of companionship could determine the balance of factions, the fate of ministers, and the course of dynasties. For the women themselves, the risks were immense. A single loss of favor could bring exile or death. To remain close to power, they had to navigate intrigue with care, using charm, intelligence, and sometimes ruthlessness. Culturally, their presence fed into myths and stories that lasted for centuries. Novels, operas, and folk tales often depicted concubines as both enchanting and dangerous, symbols of desire that could overturn empires. The phrase, "a beauty causing the downfall of a nation," entered the language, capturing the belief that the emperor's devotion to a woman could weaken the state. Whether true or not, this idea shaped how generations remembered imperial mistresses. From the palaces of China, the story stretches further still. Across the world, in every land where rulers lived above others, the pattern repeated. In Japan, in the courts of the shoguns, favorites shaped politics from behind sliding screens. In the Ottoman Empire, the women of the Sultan's harem became central figures, some wielding influence that extended across continents. Among them, the story of Roxolana, also known as Hurrem Sultan, stands out, a woman who began as a concubine and rose to reshape the Ottoman court itself. The journey now moves toward that empire, where the harem of the sultans was both secluded and powerful, and where the role of mistress became a force in the destiny of one of the greatest empires in history. In the heart of the Ottoman Empire, the great palaces of Istanbul concealed one of the most intricate and influential institutions of the early modern world, the imperial harem. To outsiders, the harem was imagined as a place of indulgence and secrecy, filled with beauty and luxury. In truth, it was also a center of politics, where women of intelligence and ambition could shape the course of an empire. Within its walls, mistresses, concubines, and consorts lived in strict order, watched over by eunuchs, bound by hierarchy, and defined by their proximity to the sultan. Among them, a few rose so high that they became remembered as dangerous mistresses, women whose closeness to the sultan transformed not only their own lives, but the destiny of nations. The most remarkable of these was Hurrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana. She was born far from the empire, in what is now Ukraine, and was captured as a girl during raids that swept across the borderlands. Sold into slavery, she was brought to the Ottoman court, where she entered the harem of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. From such beginnings, no one could have predicted her rise. Yet through charm, wit, and intelligence, she soon became the Sultan's favored companion. Hurrem broke traditions that had long guided the empire. For centuries, Ottoman sultans followed a custom of not marrying, keeping instead a harem of concubines whose sons might compete for succession. Hurrem altered this practice. She became Suleiman's legal wife, an unprecedented move that shocked the court. Her influence grew steadily. She corresponded with rulers in Europe, patronized charities and architectural projects, and advised Suleiman on matters of state. Through her, the harem was no longer a private retreat, but a political sphere in its own right. Her danger, as remembered by contemporaries and historians, lay in her ability to shift the lines of succession. Traditionally, when a new sultan rose, the brothers of the heir were executed to prevent rivalry. The choice of which son would inherit was often left to circumstance. Hurrem intervened. She worked to secure the future of her own children, especially her son Selim. This struggle led to the downfall of Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa, who was executed under suspicion of treason, a decision widely believed to have been influenced by Hurrem's counsel. In this way, she was seen as not only powerful, but threatening, her presence altering the fate of princes and reshaping dynastic continuity. Beyond politics, Hurrem's legacy reached into culture and society. She commissioned mosques, schools, and charitable foundations throughout the empire. She supported architects such as Mimar Sinan, whose works defined the skyline of Istanbul. She became a visible figure, not hidden within the harem, but acknowledged in public life, a role rarely granted to women in the Ottoman world. Her presence demonstrated that the mistress, once only a private figure, could become a central actor in the public narrative of empire. After Hürrem, the role of women in the Ottoman court remained significant. Her rise marked the beginning of what historians call the Sultanate of Women, a period in the 16th and 17th centuries when imperial consorts, mothers, and favorites held extraordinary influence. Figures such as Kösem Sultan and Turhan Sultan followed in her path, guiding policies, appointing officials, and sometimes ruling as regents for young heirs. Their power was often controversial, and many saw them as symbols of decline, blaming them for corruption or mismanagement. Yet their impact cannot be denied. Through them, the Ottoman Empire was shaped in ways that reached far beyond the private walls of the palace. The danger associated with these women was not in armies or revolts, but in their capacity to direct the will of the Sultan. Ministers and generals feared their counsel, for it could overturn policies and alter campaigns. Ambassadors from Europe watched them carefully, reporting to their kings and queens about the influence of women within the Ottoman court. The image of the dangerous mistress crossed borders, entering European imagination as a tale of both fascination and warning. As the centuries passed, the tradition of powerful consorts continued, though never with the same brilliance as under Hürrem. Yet her story remained legendary, a girl taken from her homeland, rising within the most powerful empire of her age, shaping the life of one of its greatest rulers, and leaving behind a legacy of culture, politics, and dynasty. She stands as one of the clearest examples of how intimacy could become history, and how the role of mistress could transform into something far greater. From the Ottoman palaces, the story extends once again. Across continents, the pattern of dangerous mistresses appears in different forms. In the courts of European monarchs, in the chambers of emperors, in the salons of nobles, their presence is constant. As history moves into the modern age, the figure of the mistress changes once more, from the enclosed world of dynasties to the open scandals of the 19th and 20th centuries, where mistresses shaped not only courts, but public perception of leaders. The next step in the story moves into that modern world, where kings, emperors, and even presidents were shadowed by companions whose influence stirred both fascination and unease, and where the danger of the mistress was no longer hidden behind palace walls, but displayed before the eyes of nations. As the centuries moved forward and the age of monarchs began to bend toward modern times, the role of mistresses shifted again. In the medieval and early modern world, their presence was enclosed within palaces, guarded by ritual, and hidden behind silken walls. In the modern era, the world was changing. Newspapers carried stories, pamphlets spread gossip, and the private lives of kings, emperors, and leaders became matters of public conversation. Mistresses were no longer only a courtly secret. They became figures of scandal, fascination, and political consequence, known far beyond the circles of nobles and courtiers. In France, the pattern continued long after the age of Versailles. Napoleon Bonaparte, rising from general to emperor, surrounded himself with companions who were remembered as both lovers and influences. His first wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, had once been his mistress before becoming empress. Though their marriage was turbulent and eventually ended, her presence during his rise shaped his early years of power. Josephine's refinement, social connections, and grace opened doors for him among the nobility of France. Her influence was less about politics and more about image, but it proved decisive. Even after their divorce, Napoleon's letters reveal his enduring attachment to her. showing how deeply the personal and the political remained intertwined. Other mistresses came and went in Napoleon's life, each carrying some trace of consequence. Marie Walewska, a Polish noblewoman, became his mistress during his campaigns. Their relationship was not only personal, but symbolic, for many Poles saw her as a link between Napoleon and the cause of Polish independence. Through her, Napoleon's image in Poland became brighter, even if his promises were not always fulfilled. In this way, a mistress once again embodied more than companionship. She became a vessel of hope, diplomacy, and ambition for an entire nation. In other courts of Europe, the tradition lingered. In England, the Hanoverian and later Victorian monarchs faced scrutiny for their personal lives. King George IV was notorious for his excesses and affairs, his mistresses the subject of gossip and criticism in a society increasingly attentive to morality and respectability. By the 19th century, the role of mistress had become more precarious. Public opinion carried greater weight, and rulers who indulged too openly risked losing not only reputation, but authority. In the courts of continental Europe, however, mistresses still flourished. In Austria, in Prussia, in Spain, kings maintained companions whose presence shaped their reigns. Yet the danger attached to them was changing. No longer was it only the quiet danger of influence at court. Now it was also the danger of exposure. A scandal could sweep through newspapers, damaging not only the mistress, but the monarch himself. The private became public, and with it came new forms of risk. By the late 19th century, even outside monarchies, the idea of the dangerous mistress appeared. In republics, presidents and prime ministers were not immune. Their companions could stir controversy, challenge reputations, and shape decisions. The mistress became a figure not only of courts, but of politics itself. Through all of this, one theme remained steady: the connection between intimacy and influence. Whether in the gilded halls of Versailles, the guarded chambers of the Forbidden City, or the salons of 19th century Europe, mistresses represented the same truth: that those closest to rulers often held a power unmeasured by title, but deeply felt in consequence. The cultural memory of these women also shifted in this period. Literature, plays, and later novels began to depict them in more detail, sometimes romanticizing, sometimes condemning. They became characters of both fascination and caution. To some, they were symbols of love, beauty, and charm. To others, they remained embodiments of danger, capable of leading great men astray. From here, the story moves into the 20th century, when the figure of the mistress became even more visible. In an age of photography, newspapers, and eventually radio and television, their presence could no longer be hidden at all. Political companions of presidents, dictators, and leaders entered the public eye, their influence judged not only by courts, but by entire nations. The dangerous mistress, once hidden in chambers and palaces, became a subject of headlines and public imagination. In the 20th century, the figure of the mistress was no longer confined to quiet palaces or whispered court intrigues. The modern age of newspapers, photography, and eventually cinema and radio transformed private relationships into matters of public knowledge. What had once been hidden became visible, and the influence of mistresses entered a new stage. They were no longer only companions shaping kings in secret. They became figures who could sway politics, alter reputations, and appear in the gaze of nations. In Europe, many monarchies had either fallen or were forced into new forms of constitutional rule. Yet the tradition of mistresses did not vanish. Kings and emperors of the early 20th century were still shadowed by companions whose presence stirred fascination and scandal. King Edward VII of Britain, though married to Queen Alexandra, was known throughout his life for a string of mistresses. Among them, Alice Keppel became especially prominent. She was discreet, charming, and widely acknowledged as his favorite. Unlike the flamboyant figures of earlier centuries, Alice Keppel represented a modern type, less threatening, more careful, yet still influential. Through her, Edward's image softened, and she became part of the story of the monarchy itself. The danger in the modern era lay not only in influence over rulers, but also in exposure. When private matters became public, they could challenge entire governments. In the 1930s, the scandal surrounding King Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson shook Britain. Wallis was not officially a mistress, but a companion whose presence was deemed unacceptable. The crisis revealed how personal relationships could destabilize even the oldest monarchies. Though Edward abdicated rather than keep her as mistress in secret, the story reflects the same tension. Intimacy, power, and danger intertwined in the life of rulers. Beyond monarchs, dictators of the 20th century also surrounded themselves with companions who shaped their reigns. In Italy, Benito Mussolini was known for affairs that influenced his image and sometimes his politics. In Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler maintained relationships kept carefully hidden, for his public image was meant to be that of a solitary, devoted leader. Yet in private, Eva Braun lived in his shadow for many years, a mistress whose presence was concealed until the very end, when she died beside him in the bunker. Her story demonstrates how secrecy defined much of the 20th century experience of mistresses in regimes where image and propaganda left no room for visible companions. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin's personal life was guarded with silence, but companions and mistresses are noted in memoirs and records, their presence influencing him in ways not openly admitted. In the United States, the figure of the mistress entered the story of presidents. While America had no tradition of official royal companions, scandals in the 20th century revealed how intimacy shaped even the most democratic of leaders. The most notable example was President John F. Kennedy, whose rumored affairs became legendary, with names such as Marilyn Monroe still remembered today. In these cases, the danger was not direct political influence, but public revelation, the risk that exposure could tarnish a leader's legacy. The cultural perception of mistresses in the 20th century also shifted. They became symbols of glamour, mystery, and sometimes tragedy. Films and novels portrayed them with both sympathy and suspicion. Unlike the royal mistresses of France or the imperial consorts of China, they were no longer hidden within ritual, but woven into the broader culture of celebrity and scandal. Yet the pattern remained unchanged beneath the surface. In every era, those closest to rulers carried influence. The 20th century simply made that influence visible in new ways, open to the eyes of citizens and critics alike. What had once been whispered at court was now reported in print, photographed, and debated across nations. As the century progressed, the figure of the mistress began to lose some of its old political weight, yet it retained its hold on imagination. Leaders lived in a world of scrutiny, and the presence of companions outside marriage remained both captivating and dangerous. In the end, the story of mistresses in the modern world became less about shaping policy directly and more about shaping reputation, legacy, and the delicate balance between private desire and public duty. From this point, the story draws nearer to its conclusion. The figure of the mistress has traveled from ancient courts to modern capitals, from hidden chambers to newspaper pages. The question now is not only what they did, but what they left behind. Their legacy lies in the cultural memory of danger, fascination, and influence that stretches across history. Across history, the figure of the mistress has left a long and lasting mark, not only on politics and dynasties, but also on culture, art, and collective memory. From the ancient palaces of pharaohs to the modern courts of presidents, they have been remembered in ways both grand and troubling. The influence they carried, sometimes soft and subtle, sometimes sharp and decisive, has often been reflected in how societies chose to speak about them. In literature, mistresses appeared as figures of fascination. Ancient poets wrote of royal favorites as if they embodied beauty beyond measure. Medieval chronicles, often written by clerics, cast them in darker tones, warning of temptation and downfall. In the Renaissance and Enlightenment, they appeared in plays, poems, and stories as both muses and corrupters, celebrated for charm yet condemned for excess. This dual image, half admiration, half fear, became part of their enduring legacy. In art, many mistresses became patrons, shaping the very culture of their times. Madame de Pompadour encouraged artists, craftsmen, and philosophers, leaving behind paintings, porcelains, and books that bore her mark. Hürrem Sultan commissioned mosques and charitable works that still stand in Istanbul. In these ways, their presence extended far beyond the private chambers of rulers. Their choices and their patronage became woven into the art and architecture that defined entire eras. In society, they carried symbolic weight. Mistresses often represented both aspiration and danger. To some, they were examples of how a person could rise from obscurity to influence. To others, they embodied the fear that personal desires could weaken rulers and destroy states. Proverbs, plays, and popular stories repeated the idea of the dangerous mistress, turning individual lives into cultural lessons. The human impact was equally complex. Mistresses often lived under immense strain. Their positions depended on favor, which could vanish overnight. Many faced envy, hostility, and danger from rivals at court. Their children, though sometimes acknowledged and rewarded, often lived uncertain lives, caught between recognition and rejection. Behind the glamour of influence lay the constant risk of loss, exile, or death. At the same time, they shaped the lives of countless others. Courtiers sought their patronage. Artists flourished under their support. Families rose or fell with their favor. Through them, power reached beyond ministers and generals, flowing into salons, theaters, and households. Even when they were condemned, they remained central to the way people understood monarchy, politics, and the fragile line between public duty and private desire. The legacy of mistresses also reveals much about societies themselves. Where rulers were seen as divine, their mistresses were remembered as dangerous disruptions of order. Where rulers were humanized, mistresses were remembered as companions, even protectors of warmth and wit. Their stories became mirrors of how people viewed power, not only as laws and armies, but as intimate ties shaped in silence. In the modern age, the mistress became less of a courtly role and more of a cultural figure, tied to celebrity and scandal. Yet the same themes remained. They were remembered as women who lived close to power, who shaped legacies through presence rather than office, and whose influence could not easily be measured. Now, as the story draws near its end, the path turns gently toward reflection. Across lands and centuries, from Cleopatra to Catherine the Great, from Madame de Pompadour to Eva Braun, from Wu Zetian to Wallace Simpson, the figure of the mistress threads quietly through history. Their lives remind us that power is not always formal, and that intimacy has shaped nations as surely as armies have. The final step is to rest in this thought, that their stories, remembered as dangerous, are also stories of humanity, of women who rose in worlds not built for them, who carried both charm and risk, who left behind traces in art, politics, and legend. Through the long passage of history, the story of dangerous mistresses has remained steady, moving slowly across empires, kingdoms, and modern states. From the quiet courtyards of ancient palaces to the glittering halls of Versailles, from the icy chambers of Russian fortresses to the guarded walls of the Forbidden City, their presence has been constant. They were remembered as companions who shaped rulers, as patrons who guided art and culture, as rivals who unsettled queens, and as symbols of the uneasy link between desire and authority. The thread that joins them all is not one of drama alone, but of quiet influence. The mistress was rarely a warrior, rarely a minister, rarely a sovereign in title. Yet her closeness to power gave her a voice that carried far. That voice could alter the moods of kings, soften the temper of emperors, or redirect the ambitions of generals. It could encourage peace or spark conflict. It could open doors for families or close them forever. This was why she was remembered as dangerous, not for armies commanded or decrees signed, but for the subtle way her presence touched the lives of many. For those who lived in the courts, this influence was both feared and sought after. Nobles courted the favor of mistresses, hoping that through them they might reach the ear of the ruler. Artists and philosophers dedicated their works to them, knowing that their support could secure patronage. Ministers schemed against them, fearing that their advice could undo policies carefully shaped. And the people, watching from outside the palace gates, often blamed them for the faults of kings, weaving their names into legends of downfall and decline. Yet behind all of this were human lives. Mistresses lived in both privilege and peril. They enjoyed wealth, influence, and the companionship of rulers, but also endured suspicion, hostility, and the ever-present risk of losing favor. Many rose from obscurity only to vanish again when fortunes shifted. Others endured, leaving behind lasting marks in architecture, art, and history. Some, like Wu Zetian or Catherine the Great, crossed the line from mistress to ruler, seizing authority for themselves. Their stories show the breadth of what was possible and the cost that came with it. Culturally, their legacy has lingered. In stories and plays, they appear as enchantresses and schemers, as protectors and patrons, as figures of both admiration and warning. In memory, they remain both alluring and unsettling, caught between the roles of muse and menace. This duality has ensured that their names, whether whispered in chronicles or written in newspapers, have never faded entirely. As time passes into the present, the role of mistress no longer carries the same political weight it once did. In modern democracies, leaders live under constant scrutiny, and private relationships quickly become public. Yet the fascination remains. The figure of the mistress continues to symbolize the delicate line between private desire and public power, between the intimacy of human life and the vast machinery of states. Now, as the story closes, the listener may rest in a gentle thought. These women, remembered as dangerous, were also human beings living within the circumstances of their age. Their presence reminds us that history is not only battles and treaties, but also quiet conversations, hidden affections, and private bonds that shaped the world in ways too subtle to be measured. And so, the story of dangerous mistresses comes to an end, not with sudden drama, but with calm reflection. Across time, their voices have faded, yet their imprint remains. Their legacy is found in art, in culture, in legend, and in the steady reminder that power is not always visible, and that influence often moves most deeply in silence. The night grows still, the story settles, and the listener may let their thoughts drift. History has been told slowly, gently, and now it rests, leaving only quiet reflection. In that quiet, the world of the past fades like a distant echo, and the present becomes calm once more.